Hello and welcome to this talk, one in a series of talks put on by the Friends of Norwich Cathedral. However, on this occasion, in our unusual circumstances, we are not in the Western Room at the Cathedral, but in my study room at Eton Road. So a bit out of the ordinary, but I hope you will still find it rewarding. My name is Tim Cawkwell. 20 years ago, I ran a course at Emmaus House, as 65 The Close was then called, under the title The Filmgoer's Guide to God. In 2004, a book version came out, published by Darton, Longman and Todd, now defunct, alas. And then a revised and enlarged version appeared in 2014, published by the Troubadour Press, and still in print just. Here we are. The paperback is available for purchase from me at a discount. Do let me know if you're interested. Alternatively, there is a digital version on Amazon. The book brought together two important things for me. I have been watching films week in, week out since my late teens. I'm now 72, flagging a little in my film watching habits, but not dead yet. Secondly, I am a regular worshipper at Norwich Cathedral. Christianity is 2 millennia old, and film has a long way to go to match that. When I was born, it was 50 years old, and now I'm 72, it's some 120 years old, and middle age beckons. However, I believe it still has an extraordinary future ahead of it. Let me whet your appetite for this talk. Last year, a blockbuster film called 1917 came out. The story takes place in the 4th year of the First World War and tells of a private soldier having to travel through the front line and beyond to deliver a message to an officer cut off from a field telephone. The message has to go by hand. This makes for an epic journey at the level of myth rather than fact. He passes through a French town in flames and takes refuge in a cellar. And then this happens. A mother and her baby are sheltering in the cellar, and he offers them food. For this miraculous moment, the director, Sam Mendes, uses imagery from painting. Rembrandt, you could say. Here's his adoration of the shepherds. Why should he do this? Because Christian imagery felt most appropriate to this moment. His Christian imagination was at work. Here is an outline of what I am going to talk about. I'm going to start with something about the Christian imagination as expressed in different art forms, and then go on to how it has revealed itself in films. Thirdly, I'm going to say something in particular about the French filmmaker Robe Bresson, and explore a theme about priests on film, which runs from the 1930s to the 2010s. Fourthly, in an attempt to lighten the tone, I shall talk about Christianity and film comedy. Fifthly, I shall say something about films of the Gospel, and then run through various examples of the Via Dolorosa and the crucifixion on film, going backwards from the 2010s to the 1920s, a century of cinema. Finally, I shall conclude with words of praise for an Anglican masterpiece. So, what is the Christian imagination? I define it as expressing religious ideas, specifically Christian ones, in artistic form. So, there is a rich strand of Christian poetry in the English language, ranging from the private, George Herbert, to the transcendental, Gerard Manley Hopkins, to the epic, John Milton. It deals too with our understanding of time and purpose in T.S. Eliot, and as a source of identity and wisdom in W.H. Auden. When it comes to music, where do we begin? Tallis, Bach, and all those composers that the cathedral choir bring to us each week. Music feels a natural medium for the religious imagination. And of course, architecture. How do we imagine creating a space? For us, it is cathedral-shaped, in the form of a cross, soaring, but also shared. And how does the Christian imagination apply itself to the art of film? You might think this would be difficult. Moving pictures, the movies, started in the fairground. Films were churned out for the masses, low art, not high uplifting art. It has a natural propensity for sexual content. There is a strand of great filmmaking that has revelled in shocking the audience. It all seems a far cry from the cathedral and Thomas Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer. However, the movie's roots were in the Victorian way of looking at the world, which at the popular level was a religious one. This was dismissed by intellectuals in the 20th century as sentimental, but we should not underestimate the importance of sentimentality to the mass of mankind. Second, films were very good at sex, but they were very good also at depicting love. Thirdly, in every story of difficult circumstance, a happy ending was possible, one that redeemed all or some of what had gone before. Let me make mention here of two Irish-American Catholics who were contemporaries in Hollywood, very contrasting, but joined together by their religion. The first was Joseph Breen, who became head of the Production Code Administration in 1934. Up to then, Hollywood had been censoring itself. Now, production code decisions were binding. Every film had to have its stamp of approval. Breen found himself in a powerful position to shape American morals. The second American was John Ford, the maker of about 100 films over 50 years, whose career illustrates wonderfully the journey from a Victorian sensibility to a late 20th century one, while never losing completely the idea of the redemptive ending. In both cases, the idea of a redemptive ending to films was a powerful one. An outstanding example of this sentimental culture is that Christmas staple, It's a Wonderful Life, made by Frank Capra, a Sicilian-American Catholic. Very briefly, its story is this. Small-town businessman George Bailey runs a savings and loans bank which runs into difficulty because he puts people before profit. He contemplates suicide and is ready to jump from a bridge when he is visited by his guardian angel. The angel tells him, Look at what would have happened if you had never been born. The world would be the poorer. So, George Bailey doesn't jump. There is a happy ending that saves his business. And in the final sequence, George is reunited with his family around the Christmas tree. Corny, yes, but also powerful. It's no surprise it is such a popular film at Christmas, with its themes of family and of community. I link it very much with A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Corny but powerful. Both book and film gain an inner strength by portraying the lower depths. In Dickens's case, by his portrayal of the London poor. In Frank Capra's case, by his portrayal of what it means to be a loser under American capitalism. Now let me move in spirit from America to Russia. The 19th century was rich in literary monuments, and 1866 saw the publication of one of the world's most influential books, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I have been keen on Dostoevsky since first encountering his books as a young man. Here's a copy of the book on him by Rowan Williams, written while he was Archbishop of Canterbury, and which I read recently. One of the best things I have watched under lockdown has been A Life of Dostoevsky, made by Russian TV, discovered to my delight on Amazon Prime. Actually, it is more the loves of Dostoevsky and the story of the origins of his Crime and Punishment. I would describe it as a costume drama with Russian characteristics. The novel starts with a brutal murder by a troubled young man called Raskolnikov. It's not a whodunit so much as a whydunit. He suffers guilt, he tortures his conscience, he makes confession to the police, and is sent to prison in Siberia, followed in his journey by the prostitute Sonia. At the end, her love redeems Raskolnikov. Those bare bones became the story of a notable French film from the 1950s called Pickpocket. Not about a murderer, but about a petty thief, a pickpocket in fact, called Michel. It has a celebrated sequence showing a team of 3 pickpockets at work at a Parisian railway station, a ballet of hands as it is called, and also a primer of pickpocketing. But in time, Michel is arrested and put in prison, where salvation comes to him in the form of Jeanne, lover and angel. The film was made by the Frenchman Robert Bresson. Bresson was a card-carrying Catholic all his life, although he did become grumpy at the end at the loss of the Latin Mass. He made 13 feature films, nearly all infused with religious themes, with the idea of the redemptive ending getting more and more elusive without disappearing entirely. One of his most famous films is Diary of a Country Priest. And here I want to talk about what I call the stem of Bernanos. Georges Bernanos was a French novelist of a fiercely Catholic conviction who published Journal d'un curé de campagne, or Diary of a Country Priest, in 1936. After the war, Bresson filmed it in 1950 in a notable translation of book to film. Both book and film resonated enough with the Swede Ingmar Bergman for him to make his own version of what being a priest means. Winter Light, made in 1963. And both the Bresson film and the Bergman film resurfaced in a remarkable film that appeared in 2018 called First Reformed. If you like meaty dramas about how we should conduct ourselves, and you also appreciate film art and film style, then these three films are strongly recommended. These are serious films for people who take religion seriously. I am often reminded of Philip Larkin's words on the church as a building, a serious house on serious earth. But there is also a significant number of films making comedy out of Christianity. In the 1950s came Heavens Above, with Peter Sellers as a parish priest, a rather good satire on social Anglicanism. In 1979 came Monty Python's Life of Brian. I shall come back to that film. In 1999, Dogma was released, a story about two fallen angels who plan to employ a loophole in Catholic dogma in order to return to heaven. But as existence is founded on the idea that God is infallible, their success would prove God wrong, thus undoing all creation. The miniseries Good Omens came out last year and was shown on BBC in January and February of this year. David Tennant and Michael Sheen play a demon and an angel representing heaven and hell who join forces to prevent the final battle between heaven and hell. It all ends happily, I am glad to say. These films work by being irreverent. Their popularity very much mirrors the rise of secular atheism. Not surprisingly, they stir up the religious censorship brigade. Not that I am joining in, because by and large I am against censorship. However, I do have a sense of blasphemy, which brings me back to Monty Python's Life of Brian. To my chagrin, it ends, as I am sure you will remember, with the wrong Jesus on the cross and Eric Idle as one of the thieves singing, "Always look on the bright side of life." When I wrote The Filmgoer's Guide to God, my godfather in New Zealand was annoyed it didn't talk about comedy films, and it was true that there is a generation of Anglicans who are rather keen on it. Well, it's a broad church, so my solution is not to watch it, which is a pity, because it does have its properly comic moments. So I come to the gospel film, which is common enough to form a genre, like the Western, gangster films, rom-coms, and so on. The religious blockbuster was fueled by the advent of widescreen filmmaking in the 1950s and a weakening in the production code that had forbidden the depiction of Christ on screen. To mention a few of these films, The Robe was the first on the scene in 1953. 12 years later, The Greatest Story Ever Told came out of Vatican II in 1965. Actually, the most ponderous story ever told. The Last Temptation of Christ came out in 1988 and was the subject of a startling crusade against it by the Catholic League of Decency. Pity, really. Most recently we have seen The Passion of the Christ made by Mel Gibson. Whether it's a gospel film or a splatter film or a slasher film, I shall leave the viewer to decide. It is certainly an excess of excess, which personally I find repugnant. However, everyone else seemed not to have done so. While the film cost only $30 million to make, it has grossed an astounding $600 million at the box office. The story of Jesus' passion still grips our imaginations. So let me be positive as well. The Ben-Hur story is, or was, culturally important in America. Ben-Hur, The Tale of the Christ, by Lew Wallace, was published in 1880, an immediate bestseller, so much so that it became a huge success in its adaptation for the stage. It was filmed in 1909 and again in 1926 as one of the most successful films of the silent era. This was the film chosen by MGM for a remake in 1959 and proved itself still so popular that it rescued MGM from bankruptcy. I have the feeling that the gospel story is much more dramatically filmed through the secondary characters such as Judas or Peter or Mary Magdalene. Ben-Hur is one such. It tells the story of Judah Ben-Hur the Jew and his rivalry with Messala the Roman, and is an epic of temporal power versus spiritual power. We do not see Jesus, but we see his hand giving Ben-Hur a drink. The film ends on Golgotha and the saving moment which heals Ben-Hur's mother and sister from leprosy. Corny, yes, but also powerful. Yet things are changing. It was reimagined in 2016, but the $100 million on production fell short of covering its costs at the box office, marking the end of an era of American culture, I feel. And now for something completely different. In 1975, the Italian Roberto Rossellini made a version of the Gospel called The Messiah. Jesus is a hippie, and the film is particularly engaging in the way Rossellini roots Jesus' life in that of the common people. Here he is fettling a plough with credible tools and techniques, all the time delivering his teaching to the disciples. But we have had only one film masterpiece so far that is worthy of the painted religious masterpieces done on canvas, namely Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew. Pier Paolo Pasolini was an important figure in Italian culture in the 60s, notable for his Marxism. The film was another result of Vatican II in the 1960s, and his Jesus is a radical. The 7 woes in Matthew chapter 23, Vai a voi scribi e Pharisei, hypocriti, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, is delivered with thrilling and menacing force. Its real quality lies in the way the film is visualized, and it merits a lecture on its own, since it is made so much more excitingly than in most gospel films. Particularly arresting is the figure of Jesus, embodied by a Spaniard who had never acted in a film before. That brings me to my selective run-through of how the road to Calvary and the crucifixion have been used in film. I thought I would go backwards in time to give you some idea of the depth and quality of the history of film. I start within The Fog, made in 2013, and set in the Nazi occupation of Belarus in the Second World War. The lead figure is Sushenya, a pacifist who wishes to take no part in killing or in betrayal. At the end of the film, he lies physically exhausted between two dead partisans, like Christ between the two thieves, an atonement for the terrors and horrors of the war. Moving backwards, I want to mention again Martin Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ from 1988, in which Christ is tempted to lead a life away from the cross with Mary Magdalene. It tackles head-on the theological challenge of how you show Christ on the screen, both human and divine. Next, the great Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky made the film Andrei Rublev in 1966 about the 15th century icon painter, portraying his life as a Via Dolorosa that resolves itself with the extraordinary episode of the casting of a great Russian belle. Within its 3 hours, it contains a dream sequence of the crucifixion in a snowy Russian landscape. It is extraordinary that this film came out of the Soviet Union. Coming to the 1950s, I must single out Alfred Hitchcock's I Confess. Hitchcock was a church-going Catholic all his life, and the suspense thriller I Confess has a priest harbouring the secret of a murder which has been divulged to him in the confessional box. The film culminates with a trial scene from which the priest emerges as the murder suspect, carrying the burden of his silence. Melodramatic, yes, but also powerful. In Robert Bresson's film of the Diary of a Country Priest from 1950, which I have already mentioned, the priest's life is a perpetual Via Dolorosa, as he is pushed between despair and faith. 1945 saw the arrival of one of the great masterpieces of the cinema, the Italian Rome Open City, which contains a harrowing torture scene, in effect a crucifixion. Here the priest kneels before the dead victim while his torturers look on, in a version of the Pietà. In 1935, John Ford made The Informer, a drama about a man who informs on an IRA gunman to the British Army. So he is Judas, torn between the Pharisees, the British, and the righteous band of brothers, the Irish Republican Army, and destroyed by it. At the end, mortally wounded, he throws himself at the foot of the crucifix in the church. Finally, we come to The Passion of Joan of Arc, made in 1928 as a silent film. The Joan of Arc story proved a popular martyrdom narrative throughout the 20th century, but this is the standout version. Suffice it to say that the mental and emotional agony of being tortured and killed for your convictions, for your inner conscience, is portrayed largely through Joan's face. An image from this film was the obvious choice to put on the cover of my book. So what is this Anglican masterpiece I wanted to end with? It is a British film made in 1944 by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger and called A Canterbury Tale. The film is a celebration of the English village, of the city of Canterbury, of the breaking down of class barriers during the war, and of the new role for women in the economy. And it is also a celebration of England's history, of Chaucer and the idea of pilgrimage, and above all of Canterbury Cathedral, unscathed by bombs and still the place of miracles. When the young sergeant is told this, Michael Powell shows his face surrounded by a halo. This is a film that puts the house of God at its centre. The Russian for cathedral is sobor, and the abstract noun derived from it is sobornost. It was coined as a term to describe, and I quote, the combination of freedom and unity of many persons on the basis of their common love for the same absolute values. A Canterbury Tale makes the cathedral the physical, visible expression of how all is in all. That is, the incarnation of the idea of the connectedness of all beings and of all creation. It is indeed a masterpiece.